Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for having us. Thanks for having me. My name is David Nieborg. I'm at probably one of the most fun labs here at the Institute, the Game Lab. And I do play a lot of video games. That's the number one question I do. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Before I introduce the panel, I want to give a brief introduction of the industry because it's moving so fast and so much is happening. I want to do, it's a bit of a cliche, but I'm actually kind of curious where you are coming from, because there seems to be a huge split between people you don't expect to be hardcore gamers, but I think they're here, and people who might have played not enough. You cannot play. And this is always kind of painful because I hope you're as much into gaming as I am. So who has ever played World of Warcraft here? Okay, wow, see, this fills my heart with so much joy. And who played a game on a mobile device like the last 12 months? You don't have to be ashamed of these kinds of admissions. We're in a safe place. Okay, great. Angry Birds, yes, absolutely. Candy Crush. And I'm recently playing Hearthstone. I should stop talking about that right now because I can fill 45 minutes talking about that. Hearthstone, do play it. It's a lot of fun. So the industry is moving so fast. These are the figures of last year, and you already see there these three major regions, Northern America, Europe, and Asia. And I hope you can pick up on it, but there's a lot of money to be made. And there's a huge shift in audiences. There are so much more players than ever before. It was sort of kick-started by the Wii, the Nintendo Wii, but now with the smartphones and the tablets, there are so many more players. And that's reflected, of course, in the revenue figures. And they're growing. The compound annual growth rate of the game industry is 8%. I think that's pretty substantial and has been going on sort of for decades. So people are constantly wondering when there has been a crash way back, but now it keeps growing and growing and growing up to a point like, you know, when is this going to stop? Not in the foreseeable future. And one of the interesting statistics is then the mobile segment, which is growing even faster, 19% every year. And at some point, not in the next couple of years, but at some point it might be half of the entire game industry. And in 2017, it will be a $100 billion industry. So a lot of money for an entertainment industry segment. So what do all these people play? It used to be that all these people played on consoles, and much of the literature in the field of economics management is on consoles. And that used to be the most significant part in terms of revenue of the industry in the 90s and 2000s. So your Nintendo Wii, Sega, old school, Microsoft, Xbox, PlayStation, etc. But now it's not the biggest segment anymore. It's overtaken by other segments. This particular division is by screen, but you can do it by platform, and we'll talk about that some more. Today, we're going to focus on sort of three platforms, specifically three genres of platforms. Sort of the console or TV screen, PlayStation, Xbox, and Wii, the virtual worlds, which has been talked about just now, MMO games, PC-based, and the mobile devices. And they all have very slightly different audience segments, different revenue models, business models, etc. So you're probably all very familiar with this. It's a two-sided market, and there are complementers, and these complementers are slightly different, arguably, from other parts of the industry. So this is your Xbox, this is the console market, and what's specific about the console segment is here is where so much money is made. One of the upcoming games that will be launched September 9th of this year is a game called Destiny, and it's reported that there has been invested $500 million. It's probably slightly less, but that's one game, and it should be a series, and there will be annual installment. But this goes to show these are major blockbusters with blockbuster economics. And that breaks down, if you break that down into two-sided markets, what's slightly different in the console segment, there is a clear division between publishers and developers. And we'll talk about that later some more, because I think there are many insights on what that means in a platform market to have this clear divide between publishers and developers. Publishers are Activision, Blizzard, Electronic Arts, Ubisoft, Take-Two, and developers are Harmonix, etc. So this is one of those major segments. The second segment we're going to talk about today is the PC, you're probably very familiar with, Microsoft Mac. Part of the PC is the Steam platform. I don't know if you know that, but it's sort of on top of the PC, both Mac and Windows. It's sort of a digital distribution platform, but they do much more. They do community management, anti-cheat stuff, and etc. And in the PC market, there are, again, publishers and developers, and more and more individual developers can go directly through Steam to customers. So that's a big shift in this part of the industry as well. A company like Turbine, or as they call them, indie developers, or everybody here, can go directly through Steam to your end users. That's not possible in the console space so much as it is possible in the PC segment. So that's very different. And then third, to close this introduction, is the mobile space. And I'm very interested myself for my research in this space. So we'll talk about this at the end of this panel. And the division between publishers and developers has disappeared in the mobile arena. So you can download Unity, it's a software development suite, and everybody here, you're all very bright people, can probably develop a mobile game in probably a day and push it to iOS, App Store, or the Play Store, or Google. And then you have a slightly different ecosystem, the incumbents, Electronic Arts, but you also have these new developers, publishers. An open question, how should we label them? Are they developers? Are they publishers? Like King, Supercell, you might know them, Clash of Clans. They make, again, considerable amounts of money, Harmonix and Activision Blizzard. So, without further ado, this was my introduction. I want to introduce my fabulous panel. And the first up is my fellow Dutch person. We have two Dutchies on the panel. That's sheerly by coincidence. And the first is, and this will get a lot more confusing because this is Joost van Dreunen. He is from New York City. He is the CEO of Superdata Research. He has a PhD at Columbia University in New York. My first question, I will ask an introductory question to all my panelists. And my first question to Joost is, these new platforms, Steam, Android, iOS, are they the same as the old platforms? Or are they reskinned versions of these old platforms? Or are they totally new? So what's the difference here?
They are not the same. The short version is to say, look, everything is now moving into a digital world. Traditionally, it was a retail-based business. You go to GameStop, you buy a disc, you stick it in your console, and having a user install base on hardware was the key piece. Digital allows for a lot more opportunity. As you mentioned, smaller developers can now get away with much smaller budgets, get on the iOS store and go from there. So accessibility on the supply side is very different. On the demand side, it's very different too, right? So one of the biggest shifts in the games industry in the last couple of years has been sort of a move away from the traditional hardcore gamer. I'm sure we all have this image in our head of, a slightly awkward social outcast sitting in his mother's basement, covered in Cheetos, playing a shooter game in the dark. Nowadays, that's...
Is there something wrong with that?
No, it's... I only go in much detail because that's where I'm actually from.
You're trying to perpetuate a stereotype.
There is a life after the basement, I guarantee it. You can do a PhD in this stuff.
Yeah, you can do.
So there's that. But that's the stereotype we have today. Since then, it's shifted towards a more of a mainstream type of audience. So in other words, everybody's a gamer now. Anybody with a smartphone, anybody with a PC, anybody on Facebook, somebody has touched or has been invited to Farmville at some point in their life, for better or worse. But that makes it so that on the demand side, you now are dealing with a much more diverse audience. And so games that weren't actually financially feasible before, because of the high cost of production, because of the high cost of marketing, can now actually sustain themselves. So no, they're not the same.
Great. So huge shift in audiences, and that's probably, I hope we get to talk about that some more later. The second member of our panel is Mark. He's the director of digital analytics here in Massachusetts at Turbine, a studio that's been active for 2 decades, which for the game industry is again, yeah, significant. It's owned by Warner Brothers Interactive, so it's they call it the first party studio to a publisher. Their flagship titles are Lord of the Rings Online, which is way better than World of Warcraft is, and Infinite Crisis, which is an upcoming game, which is now in beta. So my opening question to you, Mark, you have an extensive background in analytics, and in other industry sectors than the game industry, the financial sector. The game industry is widely regarded as a very innovative industry, if only in terms of technology. How advanced is the usage of analytics in the game industry? Is it that advanced?
Thanks. The short answer is it's pretty good, but needs to be a lot better. You know, at the conference today, we've seen an interesting mix of discussion about platforms, and really what's interesting to me personally is what you can do with them, right? So as an analyst, extracting information, understanding my customers, the communities, things of that nature, so I can improve my product. That's really what drives things. The gaming industry has, over the years, because we are traditionally a very creative industry, has sort of resisted the science, if you will, that comes with analytics and all of the other messy things that come with data. So many times, some of the best games are still developed in a bit of a bubble. And as a result, it's difficult to try and convince a designer that there is a really interesting and important value proposition to analytics. If I help you understand what your customers are doing, we can actually improve the gameplay experience. It'll stimulate other new design ideas, things of that nature. So, being new to the industry, I joined Turbine about 2 years ago, coming from the insurance world, a completely different kind of culture. My assessment was that we're probably about 3 years behind where other industries are in terms of their analytics. Not in terms of their technology now, but in terms of their analytics. You think about, I had a background in Wall Street, for example, where if you were to look at a modern trading floor today, you would be floored at how sophisticated analytics are there. True real-time pricing and all sorts of clearing and trading goes on. There are tremendous opportunities in gaming we haven't yet exploited. So, as I think about it on the business side of our industry, we're pretty much there, right? With KPIs and monitoring your business. Every major studio has made a big investment in a dedicated data science team or analytics team. Even indie developers now, they're very small, even single-person organizations, have the ability now to monitor what's going on in their game with a variety of different terrific software tools and other kinds of platforms they can leverage. It's still that middle ground in terms of how we can actually translate what's happening inside this virtual world that we create and sort of improve, ideally in real time, what a player is experiencing. That's sort of our next big hurdle.
Great. Thank you. And to add that extra layer of confusion, we have another Joost, or as you would say, Joost. Joost Rietveld, he is a visiting scholar at Stern, the business school in New York City, a doctoral candidate at the Cast Business School in London, and has extensive consulting in the game industry. My introductory question to you, Joost, is we're seeing these new interesting game platforms, such as the iPhone, and they have a very, very low barrier to entry. Again, everybody here, and I urge you to do it. It would be great to come back here next year and play all of our games. So that everybody can do it. This begs the question, what are the competitive advantages you see for new entrants? Or to phrase it differently, is this a level playing field? So everybody can make a game for the iPhone, but can everybody succeed on this new platform?
Yeah. So I think compared to the traditional consoles, there's 2 major differences, and one of them is, yes, we can all make a video game and publish it. And surprise, this also happens. So If you're currently entering the iOS with the game, you're competing with 200,000 competitors, right? So there's tremendous competitive crowding going on. Simultaneously, what you'll also find is that these social outcasts that other Joost was talking about, you'll find them on the traditional consoles. If you look at iOS platforms, our mothers and grandmothers own those platforms. And they're much less informed and much less prone to seek out information about what's going on within that market space, right? So what you'll see is that those consumers coalesce much more strongly towards a few titles in the market space. So in order to be successful, you need to try much harder to stand out.
Great, thank you. So we might talk later maybe as well about Flappy Bird, which is one of the most fascinating cases in the industry. A surprise hit, but maybe we'll talk about that later. My fourth panelist is Walter. He's a VP of Publishing at Harmonix, and Harmonix is based here in Cambridge. And I think I live in Cambridge as well, so I can say we can be very proud of that. He spent a considerable time working at Microsoft, so he has a sort of this dual perspective of being at a platform holder and now being at Harmonix, a developer. Harmonix published Rock Band, and in the previous presentation there was a great statement being made about games being platforms by themselves, and I think Rock Band is arguably one of those examples of a game. I don't know if you've played it. It's a plastic guitar, and you can rock out with your plastic guitar out. I urge you to do that as well. So they made that here, and what were the sales for Rock Band? Like over $1 billion in revenue?
Revenue generated by the IP is over 1.7 billion.
1.7 billion,
yeah.
Right here in Central Square. So my question, having been on both sides, both working at Microsoft and working now at a developer, can you give us some sense, now you're on the other side, what are sort of the strengths of this new generation of platforms? What do you see looking back, being there for this new generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to address the stereotypical gamer point here for a question here, because ours are actually a little different. They may be playing in their basement. They're usually playing with other people, and they're usually inebriated when they're playing our games. So, yeah, drinking party games may be how you describe what we make. We're still very proud of them. Yeah, there's probably a few Rock Band and Dance Central players in the room, and that's awesome. On the platform and the console question, so there has been, depending on how you do the math on it, either 7 generations of consoles or we're in our 8th generation of consoles. So these are, to get to the previous speaker's characterization, these are the technical platforms that you release games on, and in some respects are a middleman in terms of access to consumers. And the interesting thing about this generation is there's a couple of things. First of all, it's actually doing much better than anyone thought. People had started to write off this current generation, we'll call it the 8th generation, although some people will argue with me on that. But let's call it the 8th generation of hardware. The expectation was that it was going to underperform, that games were moving over to mobile and to Steam, and that it wasn't going to be as successful as previous platforms or the previous generation. And by all accounts, they've actually exceeded sales in the first, we're up to 10 months since launch, of the previous generation, not having launched in as many countries as the previous generation had up until this point. So from a business perspective, and it's important for you to know that's the perspective I come from, what business opportunities do these platforms create for us? It's greater than what we thought it was a year ago. The other interesting and important piece of information for us too is the number of people that are buying games digitally on these new consoles as a percentage of owners is higher, and as a percentage of revenue is much higher. So for example, if you released a digital game, not a physical game at retail, but a digital game on Xbox 360 and Xbox One right now, you would see a much higher percent of that revenue coming from Xbox One, despite the fact that There's less than a tenth of the number of Xbox Ones that are out there that people are playing on. So it creates a significant business opportunity from our perspective.
Okay, great. Thanks. What I want to do next is go through these 3 themes, which I think both in the academic community as well as in the industry are very top of mind. And they are about the old industry, the consoles, new industry, mobiles, and then if we have time left, we can talk about the role of publishers because they are so important. Or are they? We'll see about that. Okay, so let's go to the first theme. I'll continue with you, Walter, on this because you've been on both sides. Harmonix is, you could say, it's a contentious debate, an indie or at least an independent developer. Right, you're not owned by a publisher, so you're at least independent. We
are
agree
independent.
On that? Okay,
yeah,
okay.
some people wouldn't want to call us indie.
No, you're not indie,
we have
but
too
you
many
are
people.
independent.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that's clear. Can you, having a different kind of revenue and business model, can you still make mid-size games? Because these games or these budgets for the 8th generation are ballooning, and the $500 million dollar figure is substantial. So can you still, as Harmonix for these consoles, still make sort of mid-sized games, or is it just blockbuster all over?
So it's a great question. It's near and dear to our heart because it's our games are traditionally in this mid-size that David is talking about, and just to put some numbers on that, when I say mid-size and when we talk about it as an industry, it's development budgets in the $5 to $25 million range. Games that were large enough that you actually could have a retail presence. And you could probably argue those numbers a little bit, but that's the right average. And what we're seeing right now is the business opportunities on the current generation platforms, again, we're talking consoles now, not mobile, or Steam, is either in these big blockbuster games, $50 million plus development budgets, or even bigger in the case of Destiny, or in much smaller games in the $1 to $2 million, even less than that. And that's where the lion's share of the games that are being sold and purchased by consumers in that range. There's this whole middle market and essentially the reason why is, well, there's a number of reasons why, and it's probably up for debate. But the bigger the games are, there's been a little bit of a self-fulfilling cycle where the blockbusters have gotten bigger and bigger, and therefore the investments and the money are chasing the bigger numbers. And also, because the development budgets have gotten more and more expensive, it's actually really hard to make big games. People are taking less risks on new IPs and just investing in known franchises. Or in the case of Destiny, Bungie is the company who made Halo, super successful franchise for many years, and you make investments where you see less risk, where you think it'll pay off better. So that's how we view it, and it's an interesting challenge for us as a developer.
Okay, great. In the previous talks, and there has been this discussion or this statement being made that open platforms do better. And the console segment might be regarded as a very closed set of platforms. So my question to Joost Rietveld is, they are very successful platforms, at least from a perspective, arguably, as platform holders. Why can they be so successful while they are so, in many ways, so closed?
All right, that's a good question. So so consoles are usually regarded as walled gardens, right? You have to work with the infrastructure that the platform owner gives you. So I think, and it goes back to Walter's point, I think that consoles are currently kind of recalibrating as an ecosystem for blockbuster products. And you do need technological sophistication a lot, but I think when you're making a blockbuster product, you're targeting a mass audience, right? And so you just want to focus on the entertainment value of what you're doing, and therefore I think it's okay that it's kind of a walled garden.
I might be able to add a little to that, having worked in Xbox too. there's a desire when you spend, call it billions of dollars on a new piece of hardware, be it PlayStations, Xboxes or whatnot. There's a desire to have a consistent customer experience across everything that is delivered to that console. And the only way to do that is to control it. At least that's the philosophy of the walled garden, is to control the experience that people are getting. So you set a whole bunch of rules that people have to follow. People being game developers, their games have to do certain things. When you insert a disc in the console, it's supposed to do a certain thing. When you press a button on the controller, it's supposed to do like the same thing every time you press that button. And that's, at least the rationale. We can debate whether or not that's the right way to do it, but that's part of the rationale for why it's done that way.
Right. And
Can I jump off that and
Yeah, of
say,
course.
if you take the reverse, the PC for the longest time, say shooter games on PC, you were in a position where as a user you could upgrade your graphics card, or you could get a bigger monitor, or somehow reduce your frame rates, or increase your frame rates, I should say. And so that gives you, in some instances, an unfair advantage to other players. And so by having a walled garden, you can kind of standardize that. So from a player-based perspective, it's a more fair gameplay experience, which I think is key to the enjoyment and the willingness to continue buying and spending. And of course, then, the budgets, for instance, in the most recent, or for the last generation, the previous one, Grand Theft Auto 5 had a budget of $250 million, half of which was marketing, half of which was development. And so, when Take-Two Interactive goes and says, hey, we need to make this money back, they have a very small time frame to do it in, so they need everything standardized, right? It's a 6-year cycle of development. It's a lot of money that's on the table. And so that's the only way to convince publishers to actually do it. So, as these things balloon, I think that's the reason they're still successful, because it's, there's a lot of money to be had, because in the first week they sold 1 billion copies, I believe, right? Or they made $1 billion.
yeah.
Yeah, $1 billion.
Yeah, 1 billion copies. Everybody. 7 copies. It was great.
It's 33 million copies, I think, at this point. Yeah.
Which is substantial, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I think we constantly see parties like Microsoft and Sony struggling with being open, especially to these smaller independent studios, while still accommodating their big publishers.
There's one other benefit, if you don't mind, and then I'll pass the mic. The nice thing from a developer's perspective, so for somebody like Harmonix, to have a fixed platform like an Xbox 360 or an Xbox One or a PlayStation 3 or PlayStation 4 with a fixed set of hardware where people aren't upgrading their graphics cards, having different DVD players that create compatibility and QA and a whole bunch of other issues is actually really helpful. One platform, you make one game for one set of hardware, and that's a good thing for.
Because otherwise you'd be fragmenting the market, right? That's kind of what you're saying. If you're allocating $260 million towards a game, you want an addressable market of at least, 100 million people. And if people can meddle with their systems, then you might be only able to target, say, 20 million of those.
Okay, I want to switch to the second theme, and before I do that, is there a question on this particular subject of the console market? Is there anybody who has a burning question? Jeff, yeah.
Well, maybe just one. I mean, if you take the example of Microsoft, its sort of Xbox franchise, they're arguably still in the red to the tune of, what, billions, I believe it is. And so my question is, are these specialty game consoles likely to continue for a 9th generation or 8th, depending on how you want to count? Yeah. Or are we sort of seeing the last of the supercomputers for specialty games and then something else taking the place?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's really, it's a hotly debated topic in the industry as well. But I think also what Walter said in his introduction, we are currently seeing numbers that we weren't expecting, right? So the PlayStation 4 sold over 8 million units within 10 months from release. The Xbox One sold over 4 million units, and even the floundering Wii U sold over, I think, 5 or 6 million units. So this generation is performing much and much better than we expected. And we don't have a glass bowl that we can look into, but if the present is an indicator of the future, then I think the industry is doing fine. As I said, I think there's a calibration process going on in which both like these traditional console ecosystem and mobile ecosystems are going to exist next to each other, and they offer distinctively different experiences.
Can I just disagree to disagree? That's all true, right? And so to give the audience a little bit of the rest of the debate, so a large part of the industry is shifting, right? So if you look at Electronic Arts, Activision, Ubisoft, increasingly they'll report their revenues as coming from digital platforms, right? So EA is at 49%, Activision 43% of quarterly revenue coming from mobile, tablets, PC downloads, and so on. So, sure, the console will probably be around for a while, and it may even be another generation. But so the argument goes, as the budgets go up and the financial risk increases, and digital starts to, mitigate that risk, there is a really strong case to be made for publishers to say, you know what, we can actually do this ourselves, right? We can set up our own store. So EA had Origin, which I think they just folded, right? But so they can now experiment with their own online stores to directly sell you the stuff. So one of the inhibitors there is broadband penetration and download speeds, which in, say, Asia is much better, and therefore you see a thriving online games community there compared to, say, the US. But so those are all sort of the high-level macro elements that ultimately will make it more interesting to develop for digital distribution than it is for a walled garden or a hardware device. So that's the full range of it, I think.
Okay. I'm going to switch to the second theme.
Question.
Yeah, otherwise we'll run out of time. Because I do want to talk about mobile, because it's such an exciting and fast-growing segment. Mark, you have your day-to-day job, our analytics. Everything in a mobile game, like everything you do, is trackable, right? How important are analytics in the mobile space, and what would be one of the most important data sets for you, especially considered the mobile segment?
The way we've thought about this, and again, I should preface, my studio does not work in the mobile space. We're looking at it very seriously because we work for a larger company like Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers, diversifies across studios rather than within studios. So we have a San Francisco studio we set up last year to handle just mobile titles and mobile development. That said, my studio, however, provides platform services across all these game studios to handle some important functions, including e-commerce and authentication, things of that nature. So as far as mobile goes, there's sort of a stratification in terms of data and analytics, right? There are lots of very good tools out there that let you track, the basics in terms of downloads, in terms of activations, basic in-app purchases, things like that. What's more of a challenge for a developer, and those are all critically important to monitor the health of your business. What's more important for a developer oftentimes, however, is what is a player doing inside your game directly. You've created a virtual world, and therefore most of these tools, with a handful of exceptions, don't really allow you to spit out game events very easily. So as a result, if you want to actually understand what path is someone taking, is a profitable player taking a different path through your game than somebody who's not a profitable player? How quickly do players hit certain targets, and therefore how can I change my monetization strategy on the fly to accommodate that? That, I think, really is where the big win is analytically, not just in mobile, but in any game, frankly.
Right. And I think this week, one of the major companies who does that, Flurry, has been bought by Yahoo, which speaks to the importance of user analytics in mobile, particularly. Mark, you published a mobile game.
We're not going to talk about that.
No, we should. We are going to talk about it. Can you reflect from your experiences as having published that? We just don't mention the title. That's our compromise. What are the strengths and the weaknesses for you as a developer for the iOS Apple platform?
That's a great question. So we released probably our first mobile, our real efforts into mobile games earlier this year. We are, in some respects, very proud of what we did. We've got some very talented people there, and they did some great work on it. But we did not create what the industry calls a sticky experience, which essentially means something that people come back and play a lot, like Candy Crush, Clash of Clans, and games like that. Harmonix makes music games. That's what we're all about, is bringing music and interactivity together. And that is, we haven't actually made mobile games or free-to-play games in the past. We've made big retail games. I mean, they're literally big in terms of the size that you have to bring home, but they were published and sold in retail. So this was absolutely a new experience for us. It did not go as well as we wanted from a business and performance perspective. And one of the biggest challenges that we saw on the mobile platforms was finding and getting noticed. You know, Yost talked about 200,000 plus apps and games out there. And, you know, there's been a couple comments in here about being able to make a game in a day or something like that if you sit in the garage, which is probably true, but I challenge you to make a good one in a day. And the reality is there's a ton of stuff out there, and even for a company that's been around for 19 years, like Harmonix, and has made a lot of games, it doesn't mean we're going to get noticed, and we thought we would. And the reality was we had to play the same game as everyone else, spend money on marketing and customer acquisition and drive people into the game, and if a game isn't sticky and they don't stay, it doesn't become a profitable business, and that's what we learned. It's hard. It's really hard and different.
I wanted to say thanks for sharing.
I feel better now.
Thanks for sharing.
Got that off my
We'll
chest.
have a beer afterwards. Joost Rietveld, these new platforms are, you know, a very good example of a market driven by network effects. If you're Apple or Google, you're arguably really happy about that. But if you're a game developer, you might be less happy about that unless you're one of these 2 or 3 companies. So do you agree, has the mobile market become a winner-takes-all market?
He's asking you the tough question.
Yeah.
Nice.
So for developers or for the platform owner?
Well, so the platform owners are happy. I don't think somebody here would
Well,
be
so,
for
okay,
Apple.
okay. Well,
For-
let me
for
answer that.
developer, for
I'll
developer.
say that, so the short answer is yes. I would say 4 developers are incredibly happy, and the other 199 blah, blah, blah thousand aren't. So there's tremendous competition, right, in that market. There's 200,000 games out there. We, as consumers, don't really know how to make sense of that landscape. As Walter says, like, discoverability is the biggest issue. And we as consumers don't like to take risks. We don't like to spend a lot of time researching everything that's out there. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at the top 10 list, and so you'll see very strong reinforcing effects for the 5 titles that are in the top 5. So yes, it's a winner-take-all market, and this is good for 5 developers and detrimental for the rest.
Okay, so one of the elephants in the room then, and are there Apple representatives? I think you should ask. Okay.
They were, say so.
No, and I signed an NDA as well, probably. The elephant in the room for mobile, I think, is the role of Apple, because in my interviews with developers, no developer wants to go on record and say anything bad about Apple because they want to be featured in the App Store. So what is the role of Apple? Can Apple do something for developers to, you know, break through this discoverability issue? Does any one of you has a...
Again.
I'll take it head on because that's my role. So I don't think that when you say, oh, Apple's happy about all this money, I don't think they're noticing the billions of dollars that are coming in through this. It's just, I mean, it's like a bug on their windshield, really, in terms of overall revenues, right? So the thing to keep in mind is that Apple is a consumer electronics company. They want you to buy the device that sticks in the other device and then replace the wire that only fits with this generation of device. That's their business, right? So games, in many ways, for them, it's just like music. It's just the same way that Sony started buying movie studios and music companies, because it's the content that makes you buy the TVs, and so that's what Apple kind of does as a strategy, and that's a fine strategy, right? So, but if you are a 2-man development studio and you pour your heart and soul into this crappy little game that nobody cares about, and you bring it into Apple's platform, they don't have time for this, and they're really not going to care, even if it's this brilliant piece of game mechanics in there. So, do they care? It's probably too black and white to say they don't care, but it's probably too small of, too low on the list of priorities for them. The question, of course, for the major publishers, and that's where you see maybe in Electronic Arts sort of being, outmaneuvered by newcomers like King and Supercell, they've had so much clout because they could negotiate with both the retailers and the console platform owners, all these different deals that gave them a leg up on marketing, a leg up on all kind of special deals and exclusivity. That doesn't exist in the Apple iPhone world, and it doesn't exist on Google Android. And so it's kind of like the Wild West, and it's now dominated by a few big companies, and so it's very, very difficult to get in there. And there's no real monetary incentive for Apple to change that. Right? They're good, they're making their money. So.
Right.
Can I quickly build off of that?
Yeah, and then
Okay.
we'll open up the...
I'll keep it short. So the big difference between consoles and these platforms is that a console owner earns money off game content sold, right? So a video game console is sold at a loss to a consumer, and the platform owner generates royalty income from games sold. And Apple earns money off the devices that they sell, right? So the shitty developer that you talked about is in some ways like cannon fodder for the consumers that eventually want to buy the devices, and that's where the billions of dollars come in. So a different side of the two-sided market is subsidized in these environments.
So I'll shut up in a second. But so if you, by comparison, look at, say, Japan, so there you have a cell phone company called NTT Docomo. So I spoke to those guys. Their theory is as follows. So Apple takes 30% of everything that you make as a developer in terms of sales. NTT Docomo argues, what we should do the same thing. We should incentivize people to provide content for our platform. They charge only 2% of revenues. That's their fee. And so I asked them, why is it so much less? Because they're not in the business of selling devices. They're in the business of selling broadband. They want people to download as many gigs as possible. Right. That's what they charge. So they don't care.
All right. Great example. Is there time for one more question? Yeah. Yeah? On the mobile area would be great.
Just wondering about the Flappy Bird example and the investment that you mentioned, Sir Walter. Why was it successful without a guy in Vietnam posting it and then it spiked? And what are the learnings for developers and larger players from those cases?
So in some respects, you're asking, why is a game a hit? And it's like, that's the $1 million question. If I had an answer to that question, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. And it's not to trivialize your question, but it's true. Like, it's, why does a video go viral? Why is a book a hit versus, and you can come up with, you can do a bunch of archaeology and try and figure out, and in those market conditions, why that one was successful. It's a really, really hard question. And there might be some theories on why Flappy Bird. I actually am not super, I mean, I know what Flappy Bird is, but I'm not super familiar with it. If somebody has theories, please jump in. Yeah.
So the Flappy Bird story is very revealing, and it says so much about the mobile segment, because there's this guy in Vietnam who makes this game in probably 2 nights or 3 nights, maybe 4. Flappy Bird, super duper simple. And if you've seen the growth curve of Flappy Bird, people argued, oh, he gamed the system, he bought players, or he cheated in some sort of way. He probably didn't. And the growth was very organic over a couple of months. And then it reached a tipping point, and it came on Reddit and YouTube and etc. PewDiePie on YouTube. So boom. And then it came on CNN, blah, 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 etc. So you get mass media attention. Why it's such a touchy subject as well, because a lot of people think, hey, I can do a Flappy Bird. But it's, that's very, very, very hard to do it. It's like winning a lottery ticket. It's this one guy, but it's held up as an example, like everybody can make it. It's sort of an American dream kind of situation. No offense. Is there another mobile question? Yeah.
So it seems that if you look at like the Apple App Store, there's starting to be like a power law as it relates to the top rated and stuff like that. And I'm wondering, and it seems like it's kind of self-fulfilling, because if you look at, say, the Supercells or the Kings out there, and the amount of spend that they have on a daily basis, kind of in the orders of hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million, I don't think it would be outrageous to say that, in terms of numbers I've heard off the record. And when you're talking about those 5 slots, and how tough it is for somebody to kind of even break in, somebody who has a lot of experience, from a I'd say like even an analytics perspective, is there something either from the engagement, retention or kind of conversion space that you should really pay attention to as more of an independent person who would be like a Flappy Bird or something like that you guys would say, this is what I would probably pay attention to. Your day 15 retention should go X or something like that. Like what are you guys looking at from your perspective?
I'll take a stab at that, actually. We make MMOs and MOBAs, not mobile titles, but a lot of our players will study those, and a lot of our developers will study those in part to understand, are there interesting game mechanics? So the first thing is always try to get a rational explanation. Why does Flappy Birds take off? Because no one wants to hear it's a lottery ticket, right? It's a random draw on a giant population. Someone's got to win. It's not a very satisfying answer. It's probably the most correct one I can think of. But we start studying things like, what are the game mechanics here? And we actually, in some cases, like with Clash of Clans, have adopted those in our more sophisticated titles because we see that, the mobile developers who are successful have done a really good job of embodying some very simple principles about getting players to come back, to monetize, to collect certain things in their games and motivate them in a way that is part of the fabric of the game, as opposed to interrupting your process as you're playing. So there is something to be said about some of the better games actually are there because they've hit upon a formula and have executed on it very, very well. So you see a lot of copycat games trying to do the same thing. And what I find interesting is a lot of those lessons have spilled over now to other non-mobile titles. So you'll see more and more of the console titles and the PC-based titles understanding that, wow, these mechanics actually work really well, even for players who are hardcore and wouldn't admit that they were susceptible to these kinds of very simple devices, yet they are. And if you do it well in the game, it gives you a very nice revenue curve.
Are you from Apple? Because you look like you could be from.
Yeah.
And with that, so
yes.
I'd like to thank David and the entire panel. I think that was terrific.